The rain in Mayfair wasn't like other rain. It seemed to fall with a certain reluctant politeness, as if aware of the expensive wool coats and handcrafted leather shoes it was dampening. It washed the gray stone of the Georgian townhouses until they gleamed like polished slate and collected in perfect shimmering pools along the curbs of Bond Street. From the silent climate-controlled interior of her Rolls-Royce Phantom, Eleanor Vance observed this rain with the same dispassionate gaze she applied to a quarterly earnings report. The water beaded on the tinted windows, distorting the world outside into a watercolor of blurred headlights and hurried, faceless figures. Inside, the air smelled of aged leather and the faint, clean scent of her perfume, a fragrance custom-blended in Paris and worn by no other woman in London. The muted drumming on the roof was the only sound that intruded upon her sanctuary. Eleanor sat ramrod straight, her spine not quite touching the plush upholstery. At 42, she was a woman carved from granite and ice, the CEO of a financial empire built by her late husband Richard and solidified by her own ruthless acumen. Her dark hair was swept into a severe chignon, not a single strand daring to stray. Her suit was charcoal gray, its cut so precise it seemed less like clothing and more like a carefully constructed suit of armor. Grief for Eleanor was a private, orderly affair locked away in the same vault as her sentimentality. It had been 2 years since Richard's death, and the world saw only the formidable widow, the unshakable leader. The Regent Street route, James. I don't care for delays, she said, her voice low and even, cutting through the silence. Her driver, a man who had been with the Vance family for 2 decades, met her eyes briefly in the rearview mirror. Traffic is at a standstill, madam. An accident near the circus. Will be stationary for some time, I'm afraid. Eleanor's sigh was barely audible. A minute. Exhalation of impatience. She turned her attention back to the window, her mind already calculating the cost of a 15-minute delay, the ripple effect it would have on her meticulously planned afternoon. Outside, the city's rhythm was chaotic. Horns blared with vulgar impatience. People huddled under awnings, their faces pinched and unhappy. It was a messy, unpredictable world, and Eleanor despised mess. Then, through the film of rain and the glare of a nearby street lamp, she saw it. A flicker of movement, a splash of color where there should only be gray. It was on the central reservation, a small, desolate island of concrete marooned in the river of traffic. A boy. He couldn't have been more than 13, a scarecrow figure in a threadbare jacket far too thin for the biting chill of a London autumn. He was hunched over his back to the wind, shielding something with his own spindly body. James followed her gaze. It's a dreadful business, madam. Some of them are part of organized rings, you know. They use children to prey on people's sympathies. It was the logical explanation, the one her mind immediately accepted. She was about to turn away, to dismiss the scene as another unfortunate but unavoidable piece of the city's ugly tapestry. But she didn't. Something held her. The boy shifted, and she saw what he was protecting. 2 small bundles wrapped in what looked like a tattered gray blanket. Babies. One of them stirred, a tiny fist emerging from the folds of the fabric. The boy's movements were gentle, almost maternal, as he adjusted the covering, his own face exposed to the relentless downpour. He didn't hold out a hand. He didn't look at the cars. He just stood there, a lone, defiant statue against the storm. Eleanor's chest felt strangely tight. It was foolish, this sudden, unwelcome prickle of something. Pity, annoyance. She wasn't sure. She told herself to look away, to think of the upcoming board meeting, of the numbers, of the cold, hard facts that governed her life. But then one of the babies turned its head. For a single heart-stopping second, its face was illuminated by the passing headlights of a taxi, and its eyes, wide and searching, met hers through the glass. They were not blue, not brown, but a brilliant, startling hazel flecked with gold. Richard's eyes, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. The air in the car suddenly felt thin, suffocating. It couldn't be. It was a trick of the light, a projection of her own lonely, grieving mind. Richard's eyes were rare, a unique inheritance from his Scottish grandmother. They were the eyes she had fallen in love with, the eyes she saw in her dreams, the eyes she had desperately hoped to see in a child of her own. A child that had never come. The second baby whimpered, and its face too turned towards the light. The same eyes stared back. Identical. Twin pools of liquid gold and mossy green. Eleanor's impeccably constructed composure fractured. The spreadsheets in her mind vanished. The board meeting ceased to exist. There was only the rain, the boy, and those two pairs of impossible little eyes. A ghost of her husband staring at her from the faces of two street children. "James," she said, and her voice was a strained whisper she barely recognized. "Pull over. Now." The driver looked back at his expression, a mixture of surprise and concern. The traffic had begun to inch forward. "Madam, right here." The command came out sharper this time, laced with an urgency that rattled them both. "I said now." Without another word, James steered the Rolls-Royce smoothly to the side of the road, its engine purring as it came to a halt. Before he could even move to open her door, Eleanor had pushed it open herself. Her handcrafted Italian leather heel sank into a grimy puddle on the pavement, the icy water splashing against her stocking. She didn't even notice. The cold rain hit her face, plastering loose strands of hair to her cheeks, but she didn't flinch. She was already moving her determined stride, carrying her away from the warmth and safety of her car, straight towards the boy and the impossible children of the rain. The space between Eleanor and the boy was a chasm of class, wealth, and experience, bridged only by the falling rain. As she approached, he instinctively tightened his grip on the two bundles, pulling them closer to his chest as if she were a predator. His eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and defiance, darted from her severe face to the gleaming Rolls-Royce purring at the curb. He was preparing for a command to move on, for a curse for the casual cruelty of the city. He was not prepared for her to stop. "Who are you?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was steady, stripped of emotion, the same tone she used to question a subordinate on a failing investment. The boy flinched. He looked down at the babies, then back up at her, rain dripping from his matted brown hair onto his pale cheeks. "Leo." He mumbled the name, nearly lost in the noise of the traffic. "And these children," she pressed her gaze fixed on the impossibly familiar hazel eyes of the infant peeking out from the blanket. "Are they yours?" It was a ridiculous question, but it was the only one that formed. "Yes," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. "They're mine." Eleanor's perfectly sculpted eyebrow arched. "Your sisters." He hesitated for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. "No, my daughters." The lie was as thin as his worn-out jacket, but he delivered it with a desperate conviction. Eleanor took a small step back, the absurdity of the situation washing over her. A child claiming to be the father of two infants on a traffic island in Mayfair. Before she could form a response, James was at her side, a large black umbrella held aloft, creating a small dry circle in the deluge. "Madam, please, you'll catch your death," he urged, his voice tight with disapproval. "Let's get back in the car. I can call the authorities if you're concerned." Eleanor ignored him. Her attention was solely on the children. One of them began to cry a thin, weak wail that was utterly heart-wrenching. The boy Leo began to rock them gently, his own body shivering violently from the cold. He didn't ask for money. He didn't beg for help. He simply stood his ground, a tiny, solitary guardian. The cold, logical part of Eleanor's brain was screaming at her. "This is not your problem. Drive away. Forget you saw them." But the image of Richard's eyes in those tiny faces had become a hook, lodging itself deep in a part of her she thought had long since died. She made a decision. It was irrational, impulsive, and utterly out of character. "You're all coming with me," she stated, not as a request, but as an order. Leo's head snapped up, stark terror replacing his defiance. "No, we're not going to the police. I haven't done anything wrong. This is not the police." Eleanor said, her voice softening by an almost imperceptible degree. "I promise. You're cold and they are ill. Come." She turned and walked back toward the car without waiting for an answer, a queen expecting her retinue to follow. James looked from her retreating back to the bewildered boy, his face a mask of confusion. After a moment of hesitation, Leo, seeing no other choice, and perhaps sensing a strange, unyielding authority in the woman, followed her. He moved carefully, as if the short distance to the car was a treacherous path. Inside the Phantom, the sudden warmth and silence were a shock to the system. James turned the heating up, and the scent of damp wool and street grime filled the pristine air, a stark violation of the car's sterile luxury. Eleanor took a cashmere throw from the seat beside her and with stiff, unpracticed movements began to wrap it around the two infants. Their tiny bodies were frighteningly cold to the touch. Leo sat on the edge of the seat, perched as if ready to bolt. He was a small, wet animal, brought into a palace acutely aware of the water dripping from his clothes onto the cream-colored leather. He said nothing. his eyes darting around the cabin, taking in the polished wood grain and the soft glow of the dashboard lights. The babies, enveloped in the soft, dry warmth, stopped crying almost immediately and drifted into an exhausted sleep. The drive to Eleanor's townhouse was made in absolute silence. Eleanor did not look at the boy. She stared at the sleeping infants on her lap, a storm of unnameable emotions raging within her. What had she done? She who curated every second of her life to eliminate unpredictability had just invited chaos itself into her home. The iron gates of her Eaton Square residence swung open silently. As the Rolls-Royce crunched to a halt on the graveled drive, the front door of the magnificent townhouse opened. Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, a woman whose loyalty was matched only by her rigid adherence to routine, stood waiting. When Eleanor stepped out holding the 2 blanket-wrapped bundles, Mrs. Gable's professional composure was tested to its absolute limit. Her eyes widened for a split second, her lips pursed into a thin, bloodless line, but she said nothing as her gaze flickered from the babies to the soaked, shivering boy who emerged hesitantly after them. The entrance hall was a cathedral of quiet wealth. A black and white marble floor stretched towards a sweeping staircase, and a vast crystal chandelier hung from the ornate ceiling, its light reflecting off the polished surfaces. The air was still and smelled faintly of beeswax and roses. Leo stopped dead at the threshold, looking down at his muddy trainers on the priceless Persian rug. I'll make it dirty," he whispered, mortified. Eleanor turned. She looked at his feet, then at his face. For a moment, the old Eleanor, the one who would have recoiled in horror, surfaced, but she pushed it down. "Mrs. Gable," she commanded, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous hall. "Call Dr. Finch. Tell him it's an emergency. Then prepare the East Wing guest suite. I want cribs, blankets, and a heater." "Yes, madam," Mrs. Gable replied, her voice perfectly, even betraying none of her shock. Eleanor then walked to the grand living room, a space decorated in muted tones of cream and silver. Without a second thought, she gently placed the 2 sleeping babies in the center of a silk-covered sofa that had cost more than the average car. She stood back looking at them, 2 tiny alien beings in her meticulously ordered world. Gable returned with a thick towel for the boy and led him away towards the staff quarters with quiet efficiency. Left alone, Eleanor finally allowed herself to feel the full weight of her actions. She walked to a large gilt-edged mirror that hung over the fireplace. The reflection that stared back was a stranger. Her hair was a mess. Her makeup was smudged, and her eyes held a wild, uncertain light she hadn't seen in years. The fortress she had built around her heart had just been breached not by an army, but by a boy and 2 babies with her dead husband's eyes. She touched her reflection's cheek, her fingers cold against the glass. "Richard," she whispered into the silent, opulent room. "What have you done?" The house fell into a strange, suspended silence. It was the quiet of a place holding its breath. The infants cleaned, fed with formula procured by a flustered Mrs. Gable and checked over by a discreetly summoned Dr. Finch were asleep in a guest room hastily converted into a nursery. The doctor had diagnosed them with mild hypothermia and exhaustion, but assured Eleanor they would recover with warmth and proper care. Leo, after a hot shower and dressed in a set of soft pajamas belonging to the gardener's son, was a different boy. The street grime was gone, revealing a pale, fine-boned face and the same startling hazel eyes as his sister's, though his were clouded with a deep, watchful weariness. He refused to sleep in the separate room prepared for him, insisting on sitting in an armchair beside the cribs, a silent, unmoving sentinel. Eleanor observed him from the doorway unseen. She saw not a troublemaker or a beggar, but a protector. It was an unsettling alien concept. After Dr. Finch had left, Eleanor stood in the center of her silent, cavernous drawing room. The initial adrenaline-fueled shock had receded, replaced by the cold, clear logic that had made her a titan of industry. Feelings were unreliable. Memories could be false. But data was absolute. She needed proof. Before he left, she had pulled the doctor aside. Her request was delivered in a low, toneless voice that allowed for no argument. "One more thing, doctor. I need you to take samples from the children." Dr. Finch, a man who had known the Vance family for 30 years, had the grace not to look surprised. "For what purpose, Eleanor?" "A DNA comparison," she said, her gaze like flint. "Against Richard's profile. You still have it on file at the clinic from his life insurance medicals." He paused, the full scandalous weight of her request settling between them. Then he gave a slow, solemn nod. "Very well, It will be done, discreetly. Now, with the samples taken and the results pending, Eleanor was left alone with the ghost of her husband. For 2 years she had meticulously preserved his memory, encasing it in a flawless, impenetrable amber of love and shared success. Now cracks were appearing all over its surface. She walked up the grand staircase, her hand trailing along the polished balustrade. Her steps did not lead to her own bedroom, but to the one door on the second floor she had not opened since the funeral, Richard's study. It was his sanctuary, a room that smelled of old leather cedarwood and the faint lingering scent of his cologne. Everything was exactly as he had left it. A half-full glass of whiskey sat on a coaster, a collection of antique maps adorned the walls, and a leather-bound volume of poetry lay open on his desk. It was a sanctuary of curated memories, and entering it now felt like a profanity. She walked to his large mahogany desk and sat in his chair. The worn leather creaked a familiar sound that now seemed to accuse her. For a moment she did nothing, simply breathing in the essence of the man she thought she knew. Then, with a deep breath, she reached for the small brass key on her own ring and unlocked the bottom drawer of his desk. It slid open smoothly. Inside were his private effects. Things he rarely touched but always kept: old university medals, his father's signet ring, stock certificates, and behind them a small, unadorned box of dark wood. Her heart began a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. She had seen the box before, but had never asked what was inside, respecting the small sliver of privacy he maintained. It had seemed unimportant. Now it felt like the most important thing in the world. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were not jewels or financial documents, but a small stack of letters tied with a simple blue ribbon. They were written on thin, inexpensive paper in a delicate feminine hand. With a sense of dread and grim necessity, she untied the ribbon. The first letter began without preamble. My dearest R. Thank you for the weekend. Leo was so happy to see you. He spent all of today drawing pictures of the three of us by the sea. I wish you could have stayed longer. I understand your life is complicated. But please know I never expect anything more than the time you can spare. Just come when you can. All my love. Clara Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Clara. A name. A real person. She quickly read another. Leo asks about you every day. I tell him his father is a brave explorer charting new territories. I don't want him to carry any bitterness, so I only ever speak of your kindness. But Richard, sometimes I wish you would just tell her. Your wife deserves the truth. We all do. The words were a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. This wasn't a sordid affair. This was a life. A quiet, hidden, parallel life. Her hands were shaking now, a violent, uncontrollable tremor. At the bottom of the box, beneath the last letter, lay a single old-fashioned brass key attached to a simple paper tag. Written on the tag was an address in Hackney, an area of London worlds away from the manicured lawns of Mayfair. She closed the box, the click of the lid echoing the sound of a door slamming shut on her past. This was a violation of a silent pact, an excavation of a life she was never meant to discover. She stood up and walked out of the study, locking the door behind her. She did not cry. Tears were a luxury she could not afford. The cold calculus of her mind had taken over once more. The letters were a confession, but the key was a map. Her personal search had reached its limit. She needed a professional. Walking back to her own suite, she picked up her secure telephone line. She dialed a number from memory, a contact she used only for the most sensitive corporate espionage. The voice on the other end was quiet and professional. Yes, it's Vance, she said, her voice devoid of its earlier tremor, now replaced by ice. I have a job for you. A name, Clara, and an address in Hackney. She described the key. I want to know everything. Who she was, where she lived, where she worked, and what connection she had to my husband, Richard Vance. I want a complete picture, and I want it by the time the DNA results are in. There was a pause. It will be done. Eleanor ended the call and stood still in the darkness of her room, the city lights of London twinkling far below. The past was no longer a peaceful memory to be cherished. It was an active investigation. She had found the whispers of Richard's secret life. Now she would wait for them to become a scream. 48 hours. Eleanor Vance had closed multi-billion-pound deals in less time. She had orchestrated corporate takeovers, faced down hostile boards, and navigated the treacherous currents of global finance with a calm, unnerving precision. Yet these 48 hours stretched into an eternity. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall was a hammer blow against her composure. During this time, the house operated under a new, unspoken set of rules. The guest suite in the East Wing became a self-contained world. Leo rarely left the room, eating the meals Mrs. Gable left on a tray outside the door and spending his hours watching over the sleeping infants. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of Eleanor's gilded life. Eleanor, for her part, retreated into her work. She took meetings in her home office, her voice crisp and authoritative on conference calls, a flawless performance of the unshakable CEO. But her focus was fractured. Her eyes would drift to the window, her mind replaying the moment she saw those hazel eyes in the rain, rereading the devastatingly simple words of Clara's letters. Your wife deserves the truth. The truth arrived on a Tuesday morning in a plain sealed envelope delivered by a private courier. Eleanor was in her study when her assistant brought it in. She waited until the door was closed, her hand resting on the envelope for a long moment, feeling the weight of the paper inside. This was the point of no return. With a deep, steadying breath, she slid it open with a silver letter opener. The report was clinical, a series of genetic markers and statistical probabilities, but the conclusion printed in bold at the bottom of the page was a scream. Probability of paternity, 99.998%. Eleanor's eyes froze on the numbers. Her breath hitched. She dropped the paper onto the polished mahogany of her desk as if it had burned her fingers. It was real. Not a fantasy, not a mistake, not a trick of the light. They were his. Richard's. The twins were his daughters. And the boy, Leo, was his son. The meticulously constructed dam of her composure finally broke. A wave of ice-cold fury followed by a tidal wave of profound, gut-wrenching grief crashed over her. She gripped the edge of the desk, her knuckles white, her body trembling. He had stood beside her through years of fruitless fertility treatments, holding her hand while doctors spoke in hushed, apologetic tones. He had comforted her through every miscarriage, whispering that it didn't matter, that she was all he needed. He had made her believe their childless state was a shared tragedy. It was all a lie, the ultimate betrayal. It wasn't a tragedy they shared. It was a reality he had created elsewhere with someone else. For a long time she stood motionless, letting the pain wash through her. But beneath the pain, something else began to harden resolve. The betrayal was Richard's. The shame was his. The children, however, were blameless. They were innocent casualties in a war they didn't even know had been fought. Later that afternoon, she went to the East Wing. She found Leo sitting on the floor, patiently trying to get one of the babies, who was now awake and alert, to grasp a soft toy. The small room was warm and smelled of baby powder, a scent so alien in this house that it was almost shocking. Leo, she said softly from the doorway. He looked up, startled, immediately scrambling to his feet. Yes, ma'am. We need to talk. She gestured to the two armchairs near the window. He sat down warily, his posture rigid. Eleanor sat opposite him, creating a formal distance between them. She did not have the DNA report in her hand. The truth was now a part of her, not just words on a page. When I found you, she began, her voice calm and measured. You told me they were your daughters. Why did you lie to me? Leo's gaze dropped to his hands, which were twisting a loose thread on his borrowed trousers. He was silent for a long moment. She could see the internal struggle on his young face. People listen more when it sounds worse, he finally whispered, his voice cracking. If I said I was their brother, they'd tell me to go to social services. They'd say they'd get taken away. But if I said I was their father, people stopped. They looked. Sometimes they gave me money. They knew it was a lie, I think, but they listened. His logic was the twisted, desperate reasoning of a child forced to survive in an adult world. It was heartbreakingly pragmatic. I see, Eleanor said, her voice softening. I don't like lies, Leo, but I understand why you told that one. So tell me the truth now. You are their brother. He nodded, not looking up. Yes, Lily and Rose. They're my sisters. The names were soft, gentle. Clara's names. And your mother, she died. He said the words flat, devoid of emotion, as if he had repeated them so many times they had lost their meaning. When they were born. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Leo, I need you to tell me about your father. He finally looked at her, his hazel eyes so like Richard's, filled with a deep-seated confusion. I didn't know him well. He was Mr. Richard. He used to visit us. Not often. He brought presents. Mum said he was a good man, just busy. He told me to be strong and look after her. The boy's chin began to tremble. The last time I saw him, he said he was going on a long trip. He never came back. He didn't know. He had no idea of the other life of the wife of the empire. To him, Richard was just a kind, absent father figure who had disappeared. Eleanor took a deep breath. She had a choice. She could send them away, provide for them from a distance, and erase this painful chapter from her life. It would be the easy, logical thing to do. It would be what the old Eleanor would have done. But looking at the boy, at his fierce loyalty and his profound, uncomplaining sorrow, she knew she couldn't. Sending them away would be a continuation of Richard's betrayal, hiding them, keeping them a secret. "Your father's name was Richard Vance," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "He was my husband." Leo stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. The information was too vast, too impossible for him to process. He just blinked, trying to connect the dots between the mysterious Mr. Richard and this formidable, wealthy woman in front of him. You were his wife," he stammered. "Yes," Eleanor confirmed. "That makes you my stepson, and Lily and Rose are my stepdaughters." She said the words aloud for the first time, testing their weight. They felt strange, heavy, but not wrong. Leo's face crumpled. The strength he had worn like armor for months finally gave way. A single tear tracked its way down his cheek. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm sorry for all of this." Eleanor's heart ached. "You have nothing to be sorry for, Leo," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "None of this is your fault." She stood up, and for the first time closed the distance between them. She reached out and placed a hand on his thin shoulder. It was a hesitant, awkward gesture, but it was real. "You're not in this alone anymore," she said. The unspoken truth was finally out in the open. Not a secret to be hidden, but a fact to be faced. And in that moment, Eleanor Vance knew her life had irrevocably, fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a widow. She was now, impossibly, a mother. News in a house like Eleanor's did not travel. It seeped. It moved silently through the walls, carried in the lowered voices of the staff, in the exchanged glances between the driver and the gardener, in the subtle shift of Mrs. Gable's posture. The arrival of a street urchin and 2 infants was an earthquake in their ordered world, and the aftershocks were bound to be felt beyond the iron gates of the Eaton Square estate. Eleanor knew it was only a matter of time before the Vances came knocking, not out of concern for her, but out of a primal instinct to protect the family name and, more importantly, the family fortune. They arrived on a Sunday, a day traditionally reserved for quiet reflection and country drives. 3 immaculate black Jaguars slid up the gravel drive in a procession that felt less like a family visit and more like a state delegation arriving for a hostile negotiation. At the head of the procession was Arthur Vance. Arthur was Richard's elder brother, by 10 years the patriarch of the Vance clan and the chairman of the board of Vance Holdings. Where Richard had possessed a roguish charm, Arthur possessed only granite. He was a man built of old money and older prejudices, with a booming voice, accustomed to being obeyed, and a deep-seated belief that the world was divided into 2 kinds of people, Vances and everyone else, Mrs. Gable announced his arrival with a face so devoid of expression it was a masterpiece of professional neutrality. "Mr. Arthur Vance is here to see you, madam. He is in the drawing room." Eleanor took a moment to compose herself in the library. She smoothed down the front of her silk blouse, took a sip of water, and steeled her nerves. This was not a social call. This was the opening salvo in a war. When she entered the drawing room, Arthur was standing with his back to her, staring out the large bay window at the manicured garden. He was a large, imposing man, dressed in a tweed jacket that seemed to be woven from authority itself. He didn't turn around when she entered. "Arthur," she said, her voice cool and even. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He turned slowly, his face a mask of aristocratic disapproval. His eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, swept the room, as if searching for something or someone. "Eleanor, I came as soon as I heard the rumors. I must say I find them quite unbelievable." "And what rumors would those be?" she asked, walking over to the drinks cabinet and pouring herself a small glass of mineral water. She did not offer him one. "That you've taken in some stray," he said, the word dripping with disdain, "a street child, and his bastard siblings. People are saying you've lost your mind. That grief has finally unhinged you." Eleanor took a slow, deliberate sip of water, her eyes never leaving his over the rim of the glass. They are not bastards, Arthur. They are Richard's children. The directness of her statement seemed to momentarily stun him. His face darkened. You cannot possibly believe that. It's a trick. Some gutter dwellers scheme to get their hands on the Vance fortune. I have proof, Eleanor said simply. She gestured to a single file folder lying on the coffee table. A DNA report from a reputable lab. The probability is 99.998%. I imagine even you can understand what that means. Arthur strode over and snatched the folder. He ripped it open, his eyes scanning the page with furious speed. She watched as a muscle twitched in his jaw, the only outward sign that her words had hit their mark. He slammed the folder shut and tossed it back onto the table. It means nothing, he snarled. It means my brother was a fool. It does not mean these creatures have any claim on this family, on this house. They have his blood. Eleanor countered, her voice dangerously quiet. That gives them more of a claim than anyone. It was at that moment that Leo appeared in the doorway. He had been on his way to the kitchen unaware of the visitor. He was holding one of the twins, Lily, who was fussing slightly. He froze when he saw the large, angry man dominating the room, his eyes wide with alarm. Arthur's gaze snapped to him, a predator spotting its prey. He looked Leo up and down, his lip curling in disgust at the boy's simple, clean, but obviously second-hand clothes. So this is it, Arthur boomed, taking a step towards him. The heir apparent. He looks half-starved. Leo instinctively took a step back, pulling his sister tighter against his chest. Eleanor moved immediately, placing herself slightly between Arthur and the boy. That is enough, Arthur. But Arthur was not to be deterred. He saw weakness, and his instinct was to crush it. He walked over to the drinks trolley, his movements heavy and deliberate. He picked up a crystal glass and poured a generous measure of aged single malt whiskey. You see, boy, Arthur said, turning to face Leo, his voice a low growl of condescension. In this world, there are rules. There is breeding, lineage. You cannot simply walk in from the gutter and expect to sit at the table. He started to walk past Leo as if to return to the window, but as he drew level with the boy, his arm jerked as if he had stumbled. The entire glass of dark amber liquid tipped sideways, splashing all over the front of Leo's clean white shirt. The cold whiskey soaked through the thin cotton, instantly making the boy gasp and shiver. Lily, startled by the sudden movement and the cold drops on her blanket, began to cry. Arthur clicked his tongue in mock dismay. Oh, how clumsy of me, he said, his voice laced with a cruel, insincere apology. He looked down at the large, dark stain spreading across Leo's chest. He didn't look at Leo's face, which was a mask of shock and humiliation. Then, loud enough for both Eleanor and the boy to hear clearly, he added, Then again, I suppose it needed a good washing anyway. The insult, so deliberate and so public, hung in the air like poison. It was a calculated act of dominance, a way to physically mark the boy as dirty as unworthy. It was a small act of violence, but its intent was monumental, to put Leo and, by extension, Eleanor in their place. A glacial fury, colder and harder than anything she had ever felt, rose in Eleanor. The room, which had been a stage for a family dispute, now became a battlefield. She moved with a speed that startled Arthur. She took the crying baby from Leo's trembling arms and handed her gently to Mrs. Gable, who had appeared silently in the doorway, her face pale. Then Eleanor turned back to Arthur. Her voice when she spoke was no longer quiet. It was the voice she used to dismantle hostile corporations, a voice that could strip a man of his pride in 3 sentences. Get out of my house, she said, each word a perfectly formed shard of ice. Arthur scoffed. This is my brother's house. This is my house, she cut in, taking a step towards him. He instinctively took a step back. And you just assaulted a child under my protection. You are no longer welcome here. Not today, not ever again. If you are not through that door in 10 seconds, I will call the police and have you removed for trespassing. See how that looks on the front page of the Financial Times tomorrow. Arthur stared at her, momentarily speechless. He saw not the grieving widow he had come to intimidate, but a lioness defending her cub. He saw a woman who had drawn a line in the sand, and he knew with a sudden chilling certainty that he was on the wrong side of it. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the room, his face a thundercloud of rage and defeat. Eleanor stood breathing heavily, her hands clenched into fists. She turned to Leo, who was standing frozen, staring down at the dark, sticky stain on his shirt, his face flushed with a shame that was not his to bear. She went to him and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. Go upstairs and change, she said softly. This was not your fault. Do you understand me? He nodded mutely, turned and fled the room. Eleanor watched him go. The image of his humiliated face burned into her mind. The battle had been won. But she knew with absolute certainty the war had just begun. The scent of expensive whiskey and cheap cruelty lingered in the drawing room long after Arthur had gone. The house once again fell silent, but this was a different kind of quiet. It was the taut, humming silence of a wire stretched to its breaking point. Eleanor stood alone, the echo of her own voice still ringing in her ears. "Get out of my house." The fury that had propelled her through the confrontation now began to recede, leaving behind a cold, clear certainty. Arthur's attack had not been a mere outburst of temper. It was a strategic move. He had come to test her resolve, to gauge her weakness, and in his crude way, to mark his territory. The spilled whiskey was a gauntlet thrown down, a declaration that these children were contaminants to be cleansed from the Vance legacy. He had expected her to crumble. He had underestimated her. It was a mistake many men had made, and one they always came to regret. She turned and saw the stain on the priceless Aubusson rug where a few drops of the whiskey had fallen, a dark, ugly spot on a field of pale cream and rose. Without a word, she walked to the antique bell pull beside the fireplace and gave it a sharp tug. Mrs. Gable appeared instantly, her face a carefully composed mask. "Madam, have this rug professionally cleaned," Eleanor said, her voice steady. "If the stain cannot be removed, have it replaced. I want no trace of him left in this room." "Very well, madam," the housekeeper replied, her tone indicating that she understood the order was about far more than a simple stain. As Mrs. Gable retreated, Eleanor walked purposefully from the drawing room, her heels clicking with renewed rhythm on the marble floor. She did not go to check on Leo. To do so now would be to treat him as a victim, and she needed him to feel like a survivor. Instead, she ascended the grand staircase to her private office, a sleek, modern sanctuary of glass and steel overlooking the quiet square. This was her command center. This was where she had taken the reins of Richard's empire and made it her own. This was where she fought her battles. She sat behind her large, uncluttered desk and picked up the telephone. Her first call was not to her friends, not to her family, but to her solicitor, a man whose name was a byword for discretion and ruthlessness in the city of London. "Julian," she said, when he answered, foregoing any pleasantries. "It's Eleanor Vance. We have a situation." She calmly and concisely recounted the events of the afternoon, from Arthur's arrival to the DNA results, to the deliberate act of humiliation against Leo. She left out the emotion, presenting only the cold, hard facts. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Julian Pike was a man who rarely sounded surprised. "Arthur has always been a bully, Eleanor," he said finally, his voice dry. "But this is audacious, even for him. What is your objective?" "My objective is threefold," Eleanor replied, her gaze fixed on the London skyline. "First, I want immediate and full legal guardianship of all three children, Leo, Lily, and Rose. I want it ironclad. Second, I want to formally adopt them. I want them to carry the Vance name not as a privilege, but as a right. Third, I want my will updated. Effective immediately, they are to be named my primary beneficiaries, inheriting my entire personal fortune and my controlling shares in the company." Julian let out a low whistle. "Eleanor, you understand what this means. This is not just a family squabble anymore. This is a declaration of war. Arthur will fight you with everything he has. He will use the board, the press, the courts. He will paint you as an unstable, grieving widow making irrational decisions. Let him try." Eleanor said, a sliver of steel in her voice. "He thinks he's protecting the Vance legacy. I'm going to redefine it. Draw up the paperwork, Julian. I want to sign it by the end of the day. It will be done," he said, the respect evident in his tone. After ending the call, she immediately made a second one. This time it was to the company secretary of Vance Holdings. "Charlotte," she said, her tone all business, "I am invoking Article 7, Section 4 of the corporate bylaws. I want you to call an emergency meeting of the board of directors for 9 a.m. tomorrow. The agenda will be a matter of grave importance concerning the future leadership and legacy of this company." "Of course, Madam CEO," the secretary replied, scrambling to take notes. "Is there anything specific I should prepare?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Ensure the company's chief legal counsel is present and book the main boardroom. I anticipate a full house." She hung up the phone and leaned back in her chair, a strange calm settling over her. She was no longer reacting. She was on the offensive. Arthur had brought the fight to her home, a place of family and emotion. She would take it back to his, the cold, unforgiving theater of the boardroom, a place of power, money, and rules she knew how to use far better than he did. She knew the risks. Her position, her reputation, her entire future, she was placing it all on the line for 3 children she had known for less than a week. 3 children who were a living testament to her husband's betrayal. It was the most illogical, emotional, and reckless decision of her entire life, and it felt like the only choice she had ever made that was truly her own. She looked down at the city below, the lights beginning to twinkle as dusk settled. The world was a chessboard, and she had just moved her queen. The game was afoot. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. the following morning. That left Eleanor less than 24 hours to seize control of the narrative before Arthur could poison the well. In the world of high-stakes finance and old money dynasties, perception was not merely a facet of reality, it was the entire foundation. Whoever told the story first won. By late afternoon, a carefully worded press advisory had been sent to every major news outlet in London and key international financial publications. It announced an extraordinary press conference to be held by Eleanor Vance, CEO of Vance Holdings, at the Dorchester Hotel at precisely 8:00 p.m., regarding a matter of significant personal and corporate importance. The ambiguity was deliberate, a baited hook designed to create a media frenzy. And a frenzy it was. The ballroom at the Dorchester was a sea of flashing camera lights and hushed, urgent speculation. It was a strange mix of hardened financial journalists who usually reported on stock prices and seasoned tabloid reporters who smelled a scandal a mile away. They buzzed like a disturbed hive, their questions hanging in the air. Had Vance Holdings discovered a massive financial black hole? Was Eleanor Vance stepping down? Was this about the rumors of a secret family? At exactly 8:00 p.m., the side door opened. Eleanor Vance walked onto the stage and approached the single lectern. A hush fell over the room. The only sound was the frantic, percussive clicking of 100 cameras. She was not the woman they expected. She was not the grieving widow clad in somber black. Instead, she wore a sharply tailored suit of ivory white. The color was a statement not of mourning, but of clarity, of truth, of battle. Her dark hair was pulled back in its customary severe chignon, and her face under the harsh lights was calm, composed, and utterly resolute. She looked directly out at the assembled press, her gaze sweeping across them, commanding their attention before she had even spoken a word. She was not here to plead her case. She was here to state the facts. She placed her hands on either side of the lectern. "Good evening?" She began, her voice clear and amplified by the microphone carrying to every corner of the room. "I have called you here tonight to address the speculation that has been circulating over the past few days. Speculation that concerns my private life and, by extension, the stability and legacy of Vance Holdings." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. She had immediately framed the issue not as a personal drama, but as a matter of corporate governance. She had their full attention. "As many of you know, I am the widow of Richard Vance," she continued. "I loved my husband deeply. I believed I knew him completely. In the past week, I have discovered that I was wrong. I have discovered that my husband fathered 3 children outside of our marriage." A collective gasp went through the room. Murmurs erupted. She held up a single slender hand, and silence fell once more. "This is not a rumor," she stated, her voice devoid of self-pity. "It is a fact established with scientific certainty. I have in my possession the results of a DNA analysis confirming with a probability of 99.998% that Richard Vance is the biological father of a 13-year-old boy named Leo and his 7-month-old twin sisters Lily and Rose. She did not produce the document. She did not need to. Her absolute conviction was more powerful than any piece of paper. I found these children last week. They were alone, destitute, and sheltering from the rain on a London street. Their mother, a woman named Clara, tragically passed away during childbirth. Her voice remained even, but she allowed a flicker of something human, compassion perhaps, to enter her eyes. These children have endured hardships that most of us in this room cannot begin to imagine. The boy Leo has acted as a guardian to his sisters with a courage and a love that is nothing short of heroic. They are innocent, they are blameless, and they are my late husband's blood." She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intensifying. "There are those who would see these children as a shameful secret to be hidden, a complication to be managed and swept away. They believe the Vance name and the Vance fortune must be protected from them. Her voice dropped, becoming harder, colder. They are wrong. The children are not a scandal to be managed. They are a legacy to be protected, and I will protect them. This was the declaration, the climax. The room was utterly still. Effective immediately, I have begun the legal process of becoming their guardian, and in time their adoptive mother. They will be raised as my own. They will be given my name. They will be Vance's. My will has been amended to reflect their status as my legal heirs. She let that bombshell land. Then she delivered the final strategic blow, a preemptive strike aimed directly at Arthur. The legacy of a great company is built on truth, integrity, and the courage to do what is right, not what is easy. That is the principle upon which my husband built his empire. Any attempt to dispute the truth of these children's identity, any attempt to deny them their rightful place is not an act of protecting the Vance legacy. It is an act of desecrating it. It is an attack not on me, but on the very stability and moral foundation of Vance Holdings. She had turned the tables completely. She was no longer the unstable widow. She was the fierce protector of the company's core values. Arthur was no longer the concerned patriarch. He was a threat to corporate stability. I will now take 3 questions, she announced. Hands shot up across the room. She pointed to a journalist from the Financial Times, Madam Vance. How do you expect this to affect the company's stock price tomorrow morning? I expect the market to react to strength and decisiveness, she replied without hesitation, and I have demonstrated both here tonight. Next, she pointed to a reporter from a major tabloid. Is this revenge against your late husband's family? This is not about revenge, she said, her voice like ice. This is about responsibility. Next, she pointed to a correspondent from Reuters. Your brother-in-law, Arthur Vance, is chairman of the board. Has he commented on your decision? Eleanor allowed a small, cold smile to touch her lips. I'm sure we will have a great deal to discuss at the emergency board meeting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Thank you all for coming. And with that, before they could shout another question, she turned and walked off the stage, leaving behind a room of stunned journalists and a story that would be on the front page of every newspaper in the morning. She had not just entered the battlefield, she had chosen it, defined its terms, and fired the first shot. The main boardroom of Vance Holdings was a place designed to intimidate. Located on the top floor of a skyscraper in Canary Wharf, its floor-to-ceiling windows offered a godlike view of London sprawling below. The table was a single monolithic slab of polished black marble, so vast it felt less like a piece of furniture and more like a sacrificial altar. This was Arthur Vance's territory, his throne room. At 8:55 a.m., the room was already full. The 10 members of the board, a collection of grim-faced men and 2 impeccably dressed women in their late 50s, sat in their high-backed leather chairs, an air of tense anticipation hanging over them like a shroud. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his face a thundercloud, a copy of the morning's Financial Times with Eleanor's face on the front page lying pointedly beside him. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the double doors at the far end of the room opened. Eleanor Vance entered. She was alone. Her ivory white suit from the night before had been replaced by a dress of severe funereal black. The message was clear. Someone's ambition was about to die in this room. She walked the length of the table with a calm, unhurried grace, her heels clicking a steady metronomic beat on the marble floor. She didn't look at the other board members. Her eyes were fixed on the empty chair at the opposite end of the table, the CEO's chair. She sat down, placed a single slim leather portfolio in front of her, and met her brother-in-law's furious gaze. "Good morning, Arthur," she said, her voice cool and carrying easily across the vast space. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice." Arthur dispensed with the pleasantries. "We all know why we are here, Eleanor," he boomed, his voice echoing in the silent room. "We are here because of your theatrical performance last night. You have dragged the Vance name through the mud. You have created a circus. You have jeopardized the stability of this company with your emotional, irrational, and frankly hysterical behavior." He turned to the rest of the board. "The woman before you is not the leader we have come to respect. She is a grieving widow, unhinged by sorrow, who has fallen victim to a transparent and disgusting scam. She is attempting to hand over the future of this company to a nameless street urchin. I am therefore invoking Clause 12 of the shareholders' agreement. I am moving for a vote of no confidence in her leadership, and I am proposing that she be placed on an immediate and indefinite leave of absence for the good of the company and for her own mental well-being. It was a brutal, direct assault. He had painted her as mad, unstable, and unfit to lead. A few of the board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but none met her eye. They were waiting to see how she would respond. Eleanor did not flinch. She did not raise her voice. She simply opened the portfolio in front of her. "Thank you for your concern for my well-being, Arthur," she said, her voice laced with deadly sarcasm. "But I assure you my mind has never been clearer." She looked around the table, making eye contact with each board member in turn. "Arthur speaks of stability. He speaks of protecting the Vance legacy. Let us talk then about the truth. For I believe the legacy of this company must be built on nothing less." From her portfolio, she slid out 10 copies of the DNA report and had them distributed by an assistant. "This is the scam to which Arthur refers," she said as they read. "A scientific fact. The children are Richard's. That is the first truth." Arthur scoffed. "A biological accident? It means nothing." On the contrary, Eleanor continued, her voice gaining strength. "It means everything. But I know that some of you are worried about the optics. About the mother. You fear she was some sort of gold digger who entrapped my late husband." She paused, letting the unspoken fear hang in the air. "The children's mother was a woman named Clara Bell," Eleanor announced. "She was not a schemer. She was not a threat. She was an artist." From her portfolio, she produced a second set of documents. This time they were high-quality color prints. She had them passed around the table. The images were of paintings, vibrant, emotional portraits, and evocative landscapes. "These are copies of her work," Eleanor explained. "I located the small studio Richard had secretly rented for her in Hackney. He did not shower her with jewels or apartments in Mayfair. He gave her a space to create. He supported her art." The board members stared at the images, a silent testament to a life they had never imagined. The paintings were good. More than good, they were brilliant. "And she left behind something else," Eleanor said, her voice softening. She pulled out a final document, a journal. She opened it and read a single short entry. "Richard was here today. He worries so much about his wife, about his duty. I told him again that I want nothing from him that he cannot give freely. His time, his heart when he can spare it. That is enough. I pray he finds peace. I pray she never has to know this pain." She closed the journal. The room was utterly silent. The image of the scheming harlot had been systematically dismantled and replaced with the portrait of a quiet, dignified woman who had asked for nothing. "This was not a sordid affair, gentlemen, ladies," Eleanor said, her voice resonating with a newfound moral authority. "This was a tragedy, a story of a man torn between two lives. A man who, for all his brilliance, was a coward. He made a mistake, a terrible, heartbreaking mistake, but the children are not the mistake. They are the truth that is left behind." She stood up, placing her hands on the table and leaning forward, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. "Arthur wants to talk about legacy. What is the Vance legacy? Is it to be a name associated with burying the truth, with casting out innocent children because their origins are inconvenient? Is that the kind of company you want to lead? One that is governed by fear, by prejudice, and by shame?" She straightened up, her voice rising with power. "Or is our legacy something stronger? Is it built on integrity, on facing the truth no matter how difficult, on demonstrating that we have the strength and the compassion to do what is right, welcoming these children? Richard's children does not destroy the Vance legacy. It redeems it. It shows the world that we are a family and a company that does not abandon its own." She looked directly at Arthur, her eyes blazing. "You speak of my emotional state, but I am not the one operating from a place of emotion. I am operating from a place of fact, of truth, and of duty. You, Arthur, are the one governed by outdated prejudice and a desperate, fearful greed. You are the one who is unfit to lead." She had turned his own attack back on him with devastating force. A long, tense silence followed. Then Margaret Calloway, the most senior woman on the board, a formidable figure in her own right, spoke. "The evidence is compelling," she said, her voice clear and decisive, "and Eleanor's argument is sound. To cast these children aside would create a far greater and more damaging scandal in the long run. I, for one, will not support this motion of no confidence. I stand with our CEO." One by one, other board members began to nod in agreement. They saw not an unhinged widow, but a leader of incredible strength and strategic brilliance. They saw a woman who had turned a personal crisis into a powerful statement of corporate identity. Arthur Vance looked around the table, his face ashen. He saw his support evaporating before his eyes. He had walked into his throne room expecting a swift execution, and had instead been comprehensively outmaneuvered and defeated. He had lost. Eleanor remained standing, a silent black-clad victor at the head of the table. The battle was over. She had won. The victory in the boardroom was absolute, but it was a victory won in a world of marble and glass, of corporate bylaws and shareholder value. The next and far more complex battle had to be fought in a world of chalk dust school ties and the subtle, brutal hierarchies of the English education system. Leo needed to go to school. It was not a simple matter. Eleanor's wealth could buy him a place at the most exclusive preparatory school in London, but it could not buy him an easy passage. He was 13, starting years behind his peers, a boy whose life had been a patchwork of survival, not syllabuses. He carried the invisible scars of the street, a quiet watchfulness, and a deep-seated belief that he did not belong. Eleanor, with her characteristic meticulous planning, arranged for a team of private tutors to work with him for a month, a crash course in everything from algebra to Latin, designed not just to educate but to arm him. They worked in the quiet, sunlit library of the townhouse, a room bigger than any home Leo had ever known. He was a surprisingly quick study, his mind sharp and hungry for the knowledge he had been denied. The day of his entrance exam at the prestigious St. Cuthbert's Collegiate School for Boys arrived. Eleanor drove him herself, the Rolls-Royce, gliding through the quiet, leafy streets of Hampstead. Leo sat beside her in the front, an unfamiliar position, dressed in a new gray suit that felt stiff and foreign on his frame. He was silent, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that his knuckles were white. "They will ask you about your previous school." Eleanor set her eyes on the road, her voice calm and practical. "You will tell them the truth. You were privately educated. It is not a lie. I have been privately educating you for the past month." Leo nodded, swallowing hard. What if they ask where I lived?" Eleanor pulled the car to a halt in front of the school's imposing wrought-iron gates. She turned to him. The formidable CEO was gone, replaced by something softer, something fiercely protective. Then you look them in the eye and you say, "My circumstances were complicated. You do not need to give them the details of your past, Leo. Your past does not define the man you are becoming. Your character does." "And your character," she added, her voice softening further, "is stronger than any of theirs will ever be." He looked at her, his hazel eyes wide with a mixture of terror and trust. "You really believe that I don't waste my time on bad investments?" she replied, the ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Now go, show them what you're made of." He passed the exam. His scores in mathematics and science were exceptional, a raw, untutored talent that the headmaster noted with surprise. He was to start the following Monday. The first day of school was a masterpiece of orchestrated normalcy. Mrs. Gable had laid out his new uniform, the dark blue blazer with the school's crest on the pocket, the gray trousers, the striped tie. It fit him perfectly. As he came down the stairs, he looked less like a street child and more like the son of a dynasty. Eleanor was waiting for him in the hall. For a moment, she just looked at him, an unreadable expression on her face. Pride perhaps mixed with a poignant ache for the years he had lost. "The tie is crooked," she said, her voice brisk as she stepped forward and expertly straightened it. Her fingers brushed his collar, a rare, fleeting moment of physical contact. "Ready." He nodded, his book bag clutched in his hand like a shield. At St. Cuthbert's, the air itself seemed to hum with centuries of privilege. The sons of oligarchs, dukes, and CEOs strolled across manicured lawns, their conversations a confident murmur of ski trips and summer yachts. Leo, walking beside Eleanor towards the headmaster's office, felt like an imposter, a sparrow in a flock of peacocks. The headmaster, a man with a weary smile and intelligent eyes, greeted them politely. But it was in the classroom that the real test began. When Leo was introduced by his form master, a dozen pairs of curious, assessing eyes turned on him. "Class, this is Leo Vance. He is joining us today. Please make him feel welcome." The name Vance carried weight. They all knew it, but they also knew he was new, an unknown quantity. At the morning break, a boy with slicked-back blonde hair and an air of casual arrogance approached him. His name was Sebastian de Vere. His father sat on 3 corporate boards, one of them a rival to Vance Holdings. Vance, Sebastian said, the name sounding like an accusation. Never seen you around before. Which prep school did you go to, Eton Westminster? Under Leo remembered Eleanor's words. He held the boy's gaze. I was privately educated, Sebastian's friend snickered. Oh, one of those, he sneered. Too clever for the rest of us, are you? Where did your family come into their money? New money? Is it Russian, Chinese? The questions were barbs designed to place him, to categorize him, to expose him. Leo's cheeks flushed. The old instinct to shrink away, to become invisible, surged within him. But then he thought of Eleanor's face in the car. Your character is stronger. He took a slow breath. My family's money, he said, his voice surprisingly steady, is old enough to have paid for this school's library. Twice. And I believe the name is on the plaque by the door. It was a bluff, but a brilliant one, delivered with a confidence he didn't feel. Sebastian was taken aback, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged. He grunted something unintelligible and turned away, his cronies following in his wake. Leo stood alone, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had not flinched, he had not fled, he had held his ground. That evening, when Eleanor's car picked him up, she didn't ask him how his day was. She seemed to know that the question was too large, too fraught. Instead, as they drove home in comfortable silence, she simply said, There is a board meeting for the new charitable foundation tomorrow. I'd like you to sit in. He looked at her surprised. Me, but I don't know anything about that. Then you will learn, she replied. It's time you saw how the other half of your life works. It was her way of telling him that his education would not just happen in the hallowed halls of St. Cuthbert's. His real education would happen at her side. He was not just Leo the schoolboy. He was Leo Vance, and his new life in all its complexity had truly begun. The months that followed were a quiet revolution. The grand, silent townhouse on Eaton Square, once a mere showcase for wealth, began to feel like a home. The transformation was not loud or sudden, but a gradual accretion of small, significant moments. It was the sound of the twins' delighted shrieks as they learned to crawl on the Aubusson rug, now pristine and unstained. It was the sight of Leo's school blazer, slung casually over a Louis XV chair. It was the scent of Mrs. Gable baking cookies on a Saturday afternoon, a request from the children she had initially met with stern disapproval, and now fulfilled with quiet devotion. Leo was growing not just in height, but in presence. The haunted, watchful look in his eyes was slowly being replaced by a quiet confidence. He excelled at St. Cuthbert's, his sharp mind finally given the tools to flourish. He discovered a surprising aptitude for languages and a passion for history, devouring books from the library with a hunger that impressed his teachers. He navigated the complex social currents of the school, not by trying to emulate the casual arrogance of boys like Sebastian, but with a reserved dignity that in its own way commanded respect. Eleanor, too, was changing. The rigid, icy armor she had worn for years was beginning to thaw, revealing glimpses of the woman beneath. She never became overtly affectionate. It was not in her nature, but her love manifested in other ways. In her unwavering presence at Leo's parent-teacher meetings, in the way she would pause to watch the twins play, a rare, soft smile touching her lips, and in the long, quiet evenings she spent helping Leo with his homework. During these sessions, a new kind of intimacy grew between them. It was built not on shared memories of the past, but on the shared project of his future. She taught him more than just schoolwork. She taught him how to read a balance sheet, how to analyze a stock portfolio, how to command a room with quiet authority. She was not just raising a son, she was mentoring a successor. Yet for all their progress, Eleanor knew there was a piece of their shared history that remained an open wound, Clara. Her name was an unspoken presence in the house, a ghost of a mother Leo had lost and a rival Eleanor had never met. To truly move forward, they had to look back. One crisp autumn Saturday, she made a decision. Leo, she said at breakfast, there is somewhere I need to take you today, just the two of us. He looked up from his toast, a question in his eyes, but he simply nodded. An hour later, they were in the Rolls-Royce, not heading towards the familiar streets of Mayfair or the city, but east towards the vibrant, chaotic, and decidedly ungentrified borough of Hackney. The car, a silent behemoth of wealth, felt like an alien spacecraft as it navigated the narrow, graffiti-lined streets. It finally pulled up outside a modest red brick building home to a collection of artists' studios. "Where are we?" Leo asked, his voice hushed. "This is where your mother worked," Eleanor said gently. "This was her space." She produced the old brass key, the one she had found in Richard's desk. It slid into the lock of a small, unassuming door on the ground floor. The lock turned with a rusty click. The room inside was small, and a fine layer of dust covered everything, but it was flooded with the soft northern light so prized by painters. Canvases of all sizes were stacked against the walls. A paint-splattered easel stood in the center of the room, as if waiting for its owner to return. The air smelled of turpentine linseed oil, and something else, the faint lingering scent of a life interrupted. Leo stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide. This was real. This was hers. Eleanor gave him a moment before she walked over to a large canvas draped with a dust sheet. "Your father kept paying the rent on this place even after she was gone," she said quietly. I think he couldn't bear to let it go." She pulled back the sheet. It was a portrait of a young boy with startling hazel eyes, a book in his lap, a small, serious smile on his face. It was Leo, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, captured with a love that was so vivid it was almost tangible. Leo let out a small, choked sound. He walked forward slowly and reached out a trembling hand, his fingertips hovering just inches from the painted canvas, as if afraid to touch it. "I remember this," he whispered. "She was always painting. She said it was how she made sense of the world." For the next hour, they explored the small studio together. It was an archaeology of a hidden life. They looked through stacks of sketches, quick, candid drawings of him as a child, studies of the twins as newborns. A surprisingly tender sketch of Richard caught in a rare, unguarded moment of laughter. In a small wooden chest, they found her journals. They were not filled with bitterness or longing, but with observations, with drafts of poems, with the profound everyday thoughts of a woman who found beauty in the small details of her life. Eleanor sat on a wooden stool and read a passage aloud. "Today, Leo asked me if his father was a king. I told him he was something much more important. He was a good man with a difficult heart. I hope one day Leo understands. I hope one day he is able to have a life where all the pieces of his heart can live in the same house." The words hung in the dusty air. Leo was crying now, silent tears tracking down his face. Eleanor didn't try to comfort him with platitudes. She simply sat with him in the quiet, bearing witness to his grief. She felt her own grief rising to meet his, the grief for her husband's betrayal, for the lies, for the life she thought she had. But looking around the studio at the evidence of Clara's quiet, graceful existence, the sharp edges of her anger began to soften. Clara had not been her enemy. She had been another victim of Richard's weakness. "She was a good mother," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "She loved you very much, Leo." "I know," he whispered, wiping his eyes. I wish you could have met her." Eleanor looked at him, at this boy who was a bridge between two worlds, 2 women, 2 lives. She felt a profound, unexpected sense of connection, not just to him, but to the woman whose memory filled the room. "I feel as if I have," she said softly. They left the studio hours later, locking the door on the dusty sanctuary, but they did not leave the memory behind. They carried it with them. Something had shifted between them. The final ghost had been faced. The wound, while not gone, had finally begun to heal. They were no longer just a woman and the son of her husband's affair. They were Eleanor and Leo. And in a quiet studio in Hackney, amidst the scent of oil paint and old memories, they had truly finally become a family. 2 years passed. The seasons turned over London, washing the city in the soft greens of spring, the golden light of summer, and the crisp, melancholy air of autumn. Within the walls of the Eaton Square townhouse, the changes were even more profound. The house was now filled with the constant, joyful chaos of family life. Lily and Rose were energetic toddlers, their laughter echoing in hallways that had once known only silence. Leo, now a confident and thoughtful 15-year-old, wore his St. Cuthbert's uniform with an easy assurance. He had become a formidable presence at the school, not through wealth or arrogance, but through a quiet intelligence and a depth of character that made his peers respect him. He moved between the 2 worlds of his life, the privileged halls of his school, and the memory of the streets, with a grace that was all his own. Eleanor watched him, a deep, abiding pride swelling in her chest. He was everything a mother could hope for, kind, resilient, and fiercely intelligent. And she, in turn, had become a person she barely recognized from the cold, isolated woman in the back of the Rolls-Royce. The sharp edges of her grief had softened into a quiet wisdom. The armor around her heart had been replaced by an open, protective love for the 3 children who had, in saving them, saved her. The culmination of this transformation was set to take place on a bright, clear evening at the Royal Academy of Arts. Eleanor had spent the better part of a year orchestrating it. It was the launch of a new charitable endeavor, one that would redefine the Vance name for a new generation. The grand hall was filled with a curated guest list of London's most influential figures from the worlds of art, philanthropy, and finance. Soft lighting illuminated the high vaulted ceilings, and a string quartet played discreetly in the corner. But the main attraction was the art. Hung on the walls were the vibrant, powerful paintings of a previously unknown artist, Clara Bell. Eleanor had used her considerable resources to have Clara's work restored and framed. An art critic from the Times had been given a private viewing and had written a rave review hailing the discovery of a lost, brilliant talent. Tonight was both a posthumous debut exhibition and a charity launch. Eleanor stood near the entrance greeting guests. She wore a simple, elegant navy blue dress. Beside her stood Leo, looking poised and handsome in a perfectly tailored dark suit. He was no longer the shivering boy on the traffic island. He was a young man standing at her side as an equal. "Are you nervous?" she asked him quietly, noticing him subtly straightening his tie. "A little," he admitted. "There are a lot of people. They are here to see your mother's work." She said, her voice soft but firm. "They are here to see her. You have nothing to be nervous about. You are her legacy." He smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached his hazel eyes. "We both are." At the appointed time, Eleanor stepped up to a small podium. A hush fell over the room. "Good evening, and thank you all for coming," she began. "Tonight we are here for 2 reasons. The first is to celebrate the extraordinary work of a brilliant artist, Clara Bell, whose talent the world is finally getting to see." She gestured to the paintings around them. "But the second and more important reason is to launch a legacy in her name. I have known great loss in my life," she continued, her voice clear and steady, "and I have also known great unexpected blessings. The greatest of these are my 3 children, Leo, Lily, and Rose. Their mother, Clara, was a woman of incredible grace and strength. She was a single mother and a dedicated artist who faced the world with courage but with very little support. There are thousands of women just like her in this city. Women with immense talent, with children they adore, who are one small crisis away from losing everything. That is why," she announced, her voice ringing with purpose, "tonight we are officially launching the Clara Vance Foundation. A foundation dedicated to providing grant studio space and childcare support for single parents in the creative arts. We will not let talent like this fall through the cracks again. We will build a legacy of support, of compassion, and of second chances." A wave of warm, sustained applause filled the hall. As it began to die down, Eleanor saw a movement near the back of the room. A figure had been standing in the shadows by the main entrance and was now stepping forward. It was Arthur Vance. He looked older, smaller than he had in the boardroom 2 years ago. The bullish arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber demeanor. He had lost his bid for control of the company and had subsequently retired from the board. He and Eleanor had not spoken since that day. He walked slowly through the crowd, which parted for him with curious murmurs. He stopped a few feet in front of the podium, his eyes not on Eleanor but on Leo. Then he looked up at the large portrait of the young Leo that hung in the place of honor. He turned back to Eleanor, his gaze meeting hers. For a moment the old animosity hung between them. Then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He reached into his jacket pocket, took out a checkbook, and walked over to the donations table. He wrote for a moment, tore out the check, and handed it to the foundation's director. It was a donation so substantial, it made the director's eyes widen in shock. Arthur didn't wait for a thank you. He didn't say a word of apology. His pride would never allow it. But the action itself was a surrender, a public act of penance. It was his Su Nyong Bo Ka Ingia, a quiet, powerful acknowledgement that she had been right. He had fought to protect the old Vance legacy of power and exclusion. She had created a new one of compassion and grace, and hers was stronger. He turned and walked out of the hall, a man finally reconciled to his defeat. Later that night, long after the guests had gone and the twins were asleep in their beds, Eleanor found Leo standing on the balcony of his room, looking out at the city lights. The cool night air was still. He came, Leo said without turning around. Arthur, yes, Eleanor replied, coming to stand beside him. Why do you think he did that? The money. Eleanor thought for a moment. I think, she said slowly, that some people, when they are shown a better way of being, eventually choose to walk it, even if it takes them a very long time to get there. They stood in comfortable silence, the silence of a shared understanding that ran deeper than words. The journey that had begun in a downpour on a cold, lonely street had led them here to this peaceful, starlit night. You know, Leo said, turning to her, a thoughtful expression on his face. That first day in the rain, I was so scared. I thought you were going to call the police. I never thought... I know, she said softly. I was scared too. But you stopped, he said, his voice filled with a quiet wonder that had never fully faded. Why did you stop? Eleanor looked out at the vast, glittering expanse of London. She thought of Richard, of Clara, of the pain and the betrayal, and of the incredible, unexpected love that had grown from its ashes. I used to think it was because I saw your father's eyes, she said. But I was wrong. She turned to look at him, at the strong, kind, intelligent young man he had become. I stopped because I saw you. She reached out and placed her hand on his cheek, a gesture of simple, profound love. He leaned into her touch, and for the first time he called her the name that had been sitting in his heart for years. I love you, Mom. And I love you, son, she whispered back. Below them, the city hummed with a million stories. But up on the balcony, under the vast, quiet sky, their story was finally complete. A story of a family not born of blood but forged in the rain.